Hey everybody, welcome to the Kinetic C's Business AI Podcast, where we cover artificial intelligence as it relates to business and the challenges that companies face trying to adopt artificial intelligence. So if you are a business executive wanting to get the benefits of AI, you're an IT manager who's trying to integrate AI into your current operations, or you're part of the technical staff and you're trying to keep up with this constant changing technology, hopefully this podcast is right for you. So hold on tight because the water might be getting a little rough out there. In today's episode, we are going to talk about AI security. So my name is Ed Honor. I am your host, and I have been an Oracle developer and solution architect since pretty well before the turn of the century. So I have a very traditional view of security. So as an Oracle DBA, developer, solutions architect, my view of security is much different than the view of security that you're going to need when you start to adopt artificial intelligence. So in order to go through this, what I'm going to do is I am going to just walk through the process of training a large language model on proprietary company data for I'm going to put together a demo company that's historical from a documentary series that I loved when I was growing up. So we are going to create a company called Kinetic Space Sprockets. And we have our CEO, Mr. Spacely. We have our IT director, George. And then we have our CISO, our Chief Security Officer, is Elroy. So what we want to do at Kinetic Space Sprockets is we want to use a large language model to help us build our custom sprockets. So we get orders from sprockets from throughout the solar system. We make custom sprockets. So we want our large language model to help us with the quoting process. We want it to help us with the manufacturing process, putting together all the plans for manufacturing. And then we want it to help us with our customer support. Now, because large language models like ChatGPT or Llama 2 are trained on the internet and nothing about Kinetic Space Sprockets is on the internet, we're going to need to fine-tune that model with our company data. And so we're going to go through the process of doing that, but we're going to go through the process of doing that as it relates to security and data security and the things that we need to worry about. So the first thing that is going to make Elroy's head explode is that everything in AI is open source. And a lot of people have a lot of opinions on open source, but one thing I can guarantee you is that when it comes to artificial intelligence, that ship has already sailed. Open source is here. It's here to stay. If you're going to implement artificial intelligence, you're going to be using open source, or even if it isn't open source, it's going to be built upon open source. So if you're a traditional IT department, I've worked in a lot of them that would rather pay for software than get it for free because they're that adverse to open source software. But what we have is we have a lot of pressure from the top to use AI. So Mr. Spacely wants his AI projects done. And so George and Elroy, they're going to have to implement those IT projects because there is no hiding from artificial intelligence. So A, you're going to be using open source. B, it's not really a project you can just say no to because AI is here and AI is here to stay. So you're going to get that pressure from the top to implement these AI solutions. And in this case, it's fine-tuning a large language model for our own private use. So now that we've dealt with the open source issue, the next thing we have to worry about is our developers are all playing catch up. Now, anybody in AI who is not playing catch up isn't actually paying attention. You are playing catch up, you just don't know it yet. In the last 5 years I've been working with AI, the stuff that I did back in 2018 is now part of a historical documentary. I mean, things change so fast. I mean, we don't even call it machine learning anymore. We call it artificial intelligence. So things change so fast. Your developers are playing catch up. And if you're in a traditional IT world where you have an Oracle database, maybe you have a DB2 database, you've got your front-end applications, your devs are probably in the process of playing catch up. So we're going to have to rely on consultants. And we don't want to go, in this case, we're not going to go with the consultants who are learning on the job. So we're not going to go to our big box consultants that are going to bring us a bunch of people and we're all going to learn artificial intelligence together. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to go with some consultants who have some experience and have done it before. So unfortunately, we find these two, Boris and Natasha. Okay, Boris and Natasha, they might be a little bit ethically challenged, but we need consultants. Elroy isn't doing much of a background check on the consultants, so we've got these Boris and Natasha. Their consulting company, it's also a little sketchy. I mean, let's be honest, Boris and Natasha are actually managed by a moose and a squirrel. So we've got our consultants who might be a little bit ethically challenged. We're going to be using open source software. We have no choice but to go forward with the project because we're getting the pressure from the top because we need that competitive advantage that this is going to get us. And so we're utilizing our consultants. Now the next step in the process that the CISO hates is that in order to fine-tune a model, we have to put it in a certain format. And that certain format are the training files, the prompt files that get loaded into the training algorithm that fine-tunes the model. And like almost every large company, the majority of the data is in SQL. And in our case, we're going to say it's in an Oracle database. And so George and Elroy have spent years securing that data in the SQL database. So they're using label security, they've got context security, they got strong passwords, they've got single sign-on. They're on top of this, okay? But now we're going to break all of that by taking all of that data that's currently in SQL. We're going to use some open source software to pull it out of SQL, and we're going to make these prompt files out of it. Because what we need to do in order to train that large language model is we have to teach it everything about the processes that we want the model to know about. And since those models are not out on the internet, we can't just assume that our base model knows anything about making space sprockets. So now at this point, we have our open source software, we have our sketchy consultants, we have our devs that are playing catch up, so we can't really assume that they can even read through the open source software to make sure it's safe. And we're about to break almost every security standard that we've put in place over the last 30 years with our Oracle database, because now we have to pull all that data out and we need to put it into flat files. So we get started in that process, and we're playing catch up. We're going to secure the flat files, but let's talk about why we need to secure those flat files. Because honestly, you're dumping the data out of SQL and you're putting it in a format that's not the world's most useful format, except for training these models. Well, I've got Mr. Cogswell across the street who runs a competitor. And if he had these files, he could train his own LLM to use our sprocket manufacturing process in his business. So that's issue number one, is that data could get stolen and that data could be used in someone else's model and wildly improve the work that they're doing and kill our competitive edge. The other issue we can run into is what's called AI poisoning. Now, in another episode, I will talk about AI poisoning. I am not a big fearmonger on this, especially when it comes to the base models of LLMs. That's the idea where somebody is going to take your data and then they're going to make some changes to your data so that your model doesn't act the way you want it to. And in base model training, I'm not all that worried about that because it's created off of so much data, so incredibly large amounts, petabytes of data. The idea that somebody's going to go in, change a few things, and make the model behave like crazy town isn't something that I'm going to worry about. But in fine tuning, that's different. So let's just say in our manufacturing process for our sprockets, we have one of our tools has a maximum operating temperature of 200 degrees Celsius. And Mr. Cogswell gets his hands on the data, and he goes in and does a giant find and replace and change every place where it's 200 degrees Celsius to 800 degrees Celsius. And now we train our model. So all the inference, everything that's getting done off of that model is now going to assume that this part is going to fail at 800 degrees Celsius instead of 200 degrees Celsius. And then at some point down the line here, what we end up with is parts that fail and a failed manufacturing process. So we have those two reasons that this data at this point needs to be secured. Now, egress fees are real because we're going to have to take this data, and our next unfortunate issue that makes the CISO's head explode is the fact that we do not have the infrastructure that we need to do this large language model training. We don't have it in-house. It requires GPUs. It requires very specific kinds of clusters that we need to use. So we're going to have to do this training on a cloud host. So normally you'd say, okay, well, we're already got a cloud host that we work with all the time. Well, the odds are they're not a compute or a GPU cloud host. And if they are, and they're one of the big organizations that do it, it's going to be really expensive to cloud host this. So Boris and Natasha, they have these friends, Mr. Wad and Mr. Wei, and they run a GPU cloud host. It's called Weiwa or Huawei, something like that. So they have their cloud host, and we're going to take our data, we're going to egress it, we're going to move it onto their platform, which we have two issues here. One, this could be a real lot of data. This could be in multi-terabytes. So possibly transferring it over the wire isn't a good idea. So we're going to have Elroy deliver. We're going to have Elroy deliver the data and then load it directly onto their servers. And then we're not all that sure what's going on from cybersecurity on those servers. Possibly they do not have the greatest security mechanisms in place. So that is actually something that we need to worry about in our transporting of the data, and for the amount of time that the data is on that cloud host, we kind of need to worry about that. So now we're going to download the base model. So let's say we're using Llama 2. So we download the Llama 2 base model. We set up the software, which is that open source software that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. And we run our training prompt. Let's say we run auto train, and we let it train for, it might be days, it might be weeks, but we let it train for a certain amount of time on the processing we have, and we create this weights and biases file. And so this is what comes out of the training. What comes out of the training is a file that are all the changes to the weights and the biases of the base model that make it know about our space sprocket business. Everything we need to know is now in this weights and biases file. So what we have to do now is inference. We have to run the model to see if if our training worked out well. So now we need to host the model. And again, we still don't have the infrastructure in-house. Now, luckily what we can do is we can run it on our cloud host, actually on some different hardware, and we test it out. So the first thing we do is we load the base model, then we load our weights and biases, and we apply our weights and biases to the base model, and then we test it. So we go in, we ask it a bunch of questions, we test the output, and if everything worked out well, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to apply these weights and biases to our base model, and now we have our own private model. So from a security standpoint, we have two issues here. One issue is those weights and biases, if Mr. Cogswell were to get his hands on that, that's actually something better to get your hands on than getting your hands on the raw data. The raw data is huge, and you're going to do a lot of work through it, or work to get it to where you want. Or you've got this weights and biases file, and if it turns out that it's useful to you, then you apply it. Now, if I was advising Mr. Cogswell, I would want both. I would want the raw data that's coming in, and then I would want the training data that comes out, because I want to see, basically how good it applied and possibly retrain it. So now at this point, We're running inference on it. We're testing it. We're seeing if it's good. And now we need to come up with the idea of permanently hosting it. So we're not going to permanently host it on the same equipment that was used to train it. A, it's a waste of money, and B, it's actually not as efficient as setting up a network specifically for inference. Now, in the long term, what I would recommend George and Mr. Spacely to do is host the inference equipment locally on premise in their own location. If that's not an option, then the other option is to go with a hybrid cloud CPU or cloud GPU host with CPU. So you launch up a VM, you have some dedicated GPU equipment that is then used to run inference on the model, and you secure the heck out of the whole thing. So what I've described in this use case is pretty much what you're going to run into in anything you do with artificial intelligence. You're going to have to get over the fact that it's open source, and there are definitely a lot of ways to secure your open source and make sure that whatever you're running inside of your organization, that you vetted it or you've had another firm vet it to make sure that it's not doing anything too squirrely. Because keep in mind, Boris and Natasha are managed by a moose and a squirrel. So you've got everything that's in open source. You've got devs that are playing catch up. So you're utilizing consultants. You're taking the data out of your SQL database that you feel really good about and really comfortable with, and you're taking that and you're turning that into text files that now you're going to send to your GPU cloud host, who is then going to and you're then going to train your model, and then when your model is done, you've got this model that you have to do something with. So the purpose of this podcast isn't necessarily to scare you, it's to make you think about the things that you need to do in your business to mitigate all of these risks throughout the whole process. Just saying no to open source isn't going to work in this case, because there's just a lot of reasons why everything in AI is open source. I resisted it initially at first myself, but then it was sort of like how I resisted learning Python. You know, when you've been in the industry for 30 years and now all of a sudden everything's in Python and you don't want to learn it. Well, I resisted learning Python as long as I could. I've also resisted open source as long as I can. So dealing with the fact that it's open source, keeping your devs up to date, properly utilizing consultants, coming up with a way to apply a zero trust type of model from your data that's in SQL. I know there are products out there for doing that. I'm involved in a startup that does that. We just have to keep in mind that data is in SQL, even if your documents are being stored as blob files that are in a blob column in a SQL database. If you're a legacy company that has been using large relational databases for decades, that's where your data is going to be. It's not going to be in documents. You know, a lot of the AI community wants to talk about the fact that you're using graph databases, and you're using MongoDB and you're using all the newer databases, but that's just not where these legacy companies, these Fortune 500, these Fortune 100 companies, that's just not where they are on technology. They're running Oracle, they're running IBM products, they're running Microsoft products. They're not running free open source databases. So you need to worry about the fact that we're going to shoehorn artificial intelligence into the traditional business community, and there's some challenges to that, but I can guarantee you that it is something that is really worth doing.